So in the last video for this chapter, we are looking at intelligence. Um, Intelligence is something that has multiple definitions because there are so many different theories that exist as to what intelligence is. One of the main issues is it one factor? Is this one general mental capacity or mental skill that we have, or is intelligence the combination of lots of different skills? And if so, what are those skills? So in this video, we'll be looking at some of those theories. One of the most widely accepted definitions is by David Wechsler, who created multiple IQ tests that are widely used, and we'll be looking at that. But he defines intelligence as the global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with the environment. So essentially, it's your ability or our ability to learn from our experiences and to solve problems and adapt to our environment. Now, one of the earliest theories of intelligence was developed by Charles Spearman. He believed that intelligence consisted of one general mental ability, one general mental capacity. He recognized that many people might excel in specific areas, but he believed that a factor called general intelligence, or the G factor, is responsible for overall performance on tests of mental ability or on tests of intelligence. This is still a fairly common perspective of intelligence. And if it's true, it essentially means that our intelligence can be described as a single measure of cognitive ability, such as an IQ score. As you'll see when we talk about IQ tests today measure more than one thing. They do provide an overall score, but that score can then be broken down into different skills. But if this theory is true, then that one score, that one IQ score, would be enough to describe a person's intelligence level, if this is true. We then have Raymond Cattell, who came along and suggested that, in fact, intelligence can be divided into two components. And actually, many IQ tests today are based on these types of intelligence. So they are crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is your acquired knowledge and the ability to retrieve it. So basically everything you've learned throughout your life, actual facts, so knowing facts, things you've learned in school, you can kind of think of this as book smarts, all of the knowledge that you have and your ability to actually retrieve that and use that information. Fluid intelligence is then the ability to see complex relationships and solve problems. So this is knowing how to do something or the ability to problem solve. It's not knowing actual facts like crystallized knowledge. It is your ability to apply that to everyday life and to solve problems. If you've ever taken an online IQ test, which, by the way, are not reliable, they are not valid, they are not an accurate measure whatsoever of your intelligence. Please be aware of that. But if you have ever taken one, or if you've ever taken a real IQ test, you will have noticed that there are a lot of questions where you're presented with some kind of pattern, and you have to predict what's coming next. That is a measure of fluid intelligence, your ability to see the relationships between that pattern and then be able to predict what's going to come next based on that. That would be an example of an assessment of fluid intelligence. Okay. So Howard Gardner saw intelligence very differently because he saw it as different mental abilities that operate independently from one another. He studied individuals with brain damage, and he noticed that in those individuals, there would be some mental abilities that were spared even when others were lost. So that's kind of providing evidence for this idea that different mental abilities are biologically distinct and are controlled by different parts of the brain. Now, instead of studying test scores, he looked at the kinds of skills and products that are valued in different cultures, and he believed that intelligence should be defined based on the context of a person's culture. And so, based on his research, he has proposed that each person possesses at least 8 intelligences. It used to be 7. Then it was 8. Now it's, as it says here, it's 9. Sometimes it's still considered 8 because 6 and 7 are grouped together as emotional intelligence. And I'll discuss what that means in a second. First, we have linguistic intelligence. So this is the ability to use language. So people that are writers, poets, public speakers, in general, are going to have a higher level of linguistic intelligence, that ability to use language. Logical mathematical intelligence is somewhat self-explanatory. It's your logical, mathematical, scientific ability. So scientists, mathematicians are going to have higher levels of this. It's really your ability to use reason and logic. Your musical intelligence is then the ability to create, synthesize, or perform music. So your musicians, composers, singers are usually going to have higher musical intelligence. Bodily kinesthetic is the control of bodily motions and the capacity to handle objects skillfully. So obviously this includes people like dancers and athletes. They need to have a good control of bodily motions. Capacity to handle objects skillfully, that would include people that make things, craftspeople, I suppose, would fall under this as having a higher level of bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Visual spatial intelligence is then the ability to perceive the relationships between objects and how they move in space, or the ability to mentally visualize the relationships of objects or movements. So this includes sculptors, painters, architects. I shouldn't say that it includes. We all have these intelligences, just at different levels. When I say it includes these different skills, I'm saying that these are the kinds of people that would have higher levels of this intelligence, or these are the kind of jobs that would require this type of intelligence. So yeah, sculptors, painters, architects, chess players would have higher levels of this. And then that brings us to our emotional intelligence. So 6 and 7 collectively are considered emotional intelligence, which is the ability to understand the emotions of yourself and others, to show empathy, to understand social relationships and social cues. It also includes the ability to regulate your emotions, and to respond to other people in culturally appropriate ways. So individually, what these mean: interpersonal is the understanding of other people's emotions, motives, and intentions. So basically just understanding other people. So these are your clinical psychologists, your salespeople. If you're in sales, you need to have a good understanding of other people and what motivates them and how to best sell to them. You then have intrapersonal, which is then your understanding of your own emotions, motives, and intentions. So at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned that if you take anything from this Psych 1 class, I hope that it is a better understanding of yourself than other people. Essentially, what I want you to take from this class, what I hope you gain, is greater emotional intelligence. If nothing else, I want you to leave this class having a better understanding of your own emotions and why you behave the way you do, as well as why other people behave the way they do, and a better understanding of their emotions. 8, we then have naturalist intelligence, which is the ability to discern patterns in nature. So these are your ecologists, zoologists, botanists, anyone working in nature. And then finally, we have existential intelligence. So Gardner defines this partly as a concern with ultimate life issues and as the capacity to locate oneself with respect to the furthest reaches of the cosmos. Basically, this is the ability to tackle deeper questions about the human experience. So, for example, asking questions about the meaning of life and death, the experience of love. I imagine quantum physics falls under this. So that ability or that interest in those deeper questions and the ability to really tackle those questions and think about those questions. Then we have Robert Sternberg, who agreed with Gardner that intelligence is much broader than the range of mental abilities measured by a conventional IQ test, but he disagreed with Gardner's notion of multiple intelligences, mainly because he sees some of Gardner's intelligences as just specialized talents, whereas he thinks intelligence is a more generalized quality. So, for example, he points out that you would be able to function, pretty much okay, just fine in most societies without any musical ability. So he's arguing that some of those intelligences maybe should not be classed as intelligences. That's just his opinion. Um, so instead, his theory focuses on the universal aspects of intelligent behavior, and the importance of adapting to a particular social and cultural environment. You'll notice that term, adapting to the environment, coming up a lot with these theories of intelligence. That seems to be one of the more agreed upon features, is that intelligence to some extent is that ability to learn from your experiences, and adapt based on those experiences and adapt to your environment. So he proposed this concept of intelligence, which has three distinct types of mental abilities: analytical, creative, and practical intelligence. So analytical intelligence is academic problem solving and computation. Basically, it's the mental processes or strategies used in learning how to solve problems. It is your ability to analyze, to evaluate, to judge, to compare and contrast things. They're the mental skills that you use in school, that you use to learn and to solve problems. Um, Creative intelligence is then the ability to deal with novel situations by drawing on existing skills and knowledge, or the ability to invent solutions. This is, so imaginative and innovative problem solving. It comes back to that ability to think outside of the box, to come up with novel solutions for new problems. Then we have practical intelligence, so street smarts and common sense. This is where it really hones in on this ability to adapt to the environment. I think we probably all know those people that are super, super intelligent, have, lots of book smarts, they have great crystallized intelligence, but when it comes to common sense, they don't really have any. So again, kind of supporting this idea that intelligence is made up of these distinct components. So yes, practical intelligence is that just common sense, and the ability to be aware of things in your environment and to adapt to them. So before we talk about how the IQ test was developed and what that measures, I just want to differentiate between an aptitude test and an achievement test. An aptitude test is a test that's assessing your ability to learn. That's what an IQ test is doing. An achievement test is testing your acquired knowledge, so everything you've already learned. So an example of an achievement test would be the SATs. An achievement test is looking at your knowledge of science or of math or of English. It's looking at what you've learned. An aptitude test, like I said, is looking at that ability to learn. So it's looking at whether or not you have the skills needed to actually learn. So actually, the way they diagnose learning disabilities is through an aptitude test and an achievement test. What they'll do is they'll give someone an aptitude test, and they're trying to look at, okay, what is your ability to learn? And then they'll give them an achievement test, and they'll look at the difference between the two scores. If you have someone that has an IQ of 120, then you would accept something similar on an achievement test. And if you have someone that's scoring 90, that is a big difference, and that indicates there's a problem going on, because you have someone that has this ability to learn at a certain level, but they're not learning at that level. So anyway, focusing on IQ tests. So in the early 1900s, there was someone called Alfred Binet who was asked to develop an intelligence test to use on children in France to determine which ones might have difficulty in school. And so instead of focusing on specific abilities such as reading and math, he focused on mental abilities such as memory, attention, the ability to understand relationships between things, basically the mental skills that allow us to learn. Okay. If you have a really hard time attending to information, or you have a really poor memory, then that's going to potentially affect your ability to learn. Now, later on, a psychologist from Stanford University came along and modified Benet's work by standardizing the administration of this intelligence test. And so what that means is he basically said, this is how we are going to administer this test. Anyone that administers this IQ test must do it in this way. Because if you have people administering that test in different ways, then you can't compare the scores, and the scores don't really mean anything. You need to make sure that it's being conducted the same way every single time. He also normed it. And what I mean by that is he took thousands and thousands of children and tested them to establish the norm, to establish the average score that most children received. Because if you're trying to say, well, this child has intellectual difficulties and they're going to have struggles, they're going to struggle in school. In order to do that, you need to be able to compare them to other children their age and say, this is where they should be at, this is where they're actually at. So he then decided to call the resulting score the intelligence quotient, or IQ. So that's where the IQ test originates from. Now, the Stanford Binet test is still used, but not very commonly, because there are now better IQ tests. We now have the Wechsler tests. So basically, David Wechsler came along years after the Stanford Binet test, and he wasn't satisfied with that test because he believed that the intelligence involved, again, this variety of mental abilities, not just one. So he criticized the Stanford Binet test for only producing this one IQ score. Nowadays, the modern version of it does test for multiple intelligences, different domains, but originally it just produced this one score. So Wechsler developed these IQ tests. The one I've mentioned here is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. There is also one for children. He has different versions of this test. I do want to apologize because what you see here right now is different to what's in the PowerPoint slides I shared with you. I made a mistake and I put the child test subscales. These are now the adult subscales. So there are 4. So the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale tests verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. So verbal comprehension is looking at a person's ability to understand, use, and think with spoken language. Your ability to use language. It also looks at, to some extent, some of your acquired knowledge. So there are a few tests that look at whether you know kind of the meaning of words and various facts. So it's testing, to some extent, your crystallized knowledge. And your ability to retrieve that information from long-term memory. That's really what it's getting at, is that ability to retrieve that information. Then perceptual reasoning this is where it's looking at your fluid intelligence. So it looks at your ability to accurately interpret, organize, and think with visual information. So it's looking at nonverbal reasoning skills, and it looks at your visual perceptual abilities. So for example, one of the tests that comes under perceptual reasoning, you get given all of these different shaped blocks, and you're given a pattern, and you have a certain amount of time to create that pattern with those blocks. And as you progress, they get more complicated. The ones with different patterns that I mentioned before, we have to predict what comes next. That would come under perceptual reasoning too. So again, it's primarily looking at your fluid intelligence. The working memory index is looking at your ability to hold information and manipulate that information in your mind. So, for example, a lot of the items that fall under this are math-related questions. It's not so much looking at your mathematical ability. It's really looking at your ability to take information and hold that in your mind while you do something with it, while you're manipulating it. It's your working memory, which we will be talking about next week when we talk about memory. And then we have processing speed, which is your ability to process visual information quickly and efficiently. So, well, not just visual information. well, primarily in visual information. It's basically measuring your visual and your motor speed. So you have some scanning tasks where you have a code and you have to quickly scan for the correct code. Um, oh, there's another test that I cannot remember off the top of my head. But it's looking at how quickly you process information, essentially, visually, and in terms of how quick your motor speed is. Then we have the last thing I want to mention. Sorry, I'm losing track. The last thing I want to mention is the average IQ score in Western cultures is 100. So that means on average, most people have an IQ score of 100. 68% of the population fall between 85 and 115. 98% of the population fall between 70 and 130. Anything over 130 is usually considered gifted, and anything below 70 is considered an intellectual disability. This is not the same as a learning disability. A learning disability, as I mentioned, you're looking at the difference between a person's IQ and their achievement. So they could have a high IQ, they're just not performing at that level. Whereas with an intellectual disability, it's the IQ that is low. So Forrest Gump, that is a character with an intellectual disability. If any of you have recently watched the trials of Gabriel Fernandez on Netflix, you'll have noticed that one of the things they were doing with the mom was they were going to argue that she had an intellectual disability. They were assessing her for that. This is something that comes up in a lot of criminal defense cases. They'll try to argue, I mean, in some cases the person really does have an intellectual disability, but quite often they'll try to argue that basically as an argument for someone being not guilty by reason of insanity. You could make the claim that the person didn't know that what they were doing was wrong because they had an IQ below 70, because they had an intellectual disability. In the case of the Gabriel Fernandez case, we don't know what they end up finding because, well, I don't want to ruin it for anyone if you haven't watched it yet, so I won't tell you what happens. But we never find out whether she does meet criteria for that. My impression is probably she wouldn't. That was just something they were going for. But anyway, I'm rambling now, so I'm going to stop, and I will see you in the next video.